Greetings gamers, my name is Anto and today I want to talk to you about some of my best tips for making your encounter maps much more interesting and engaging for your players. This video is sponsored by Cheipeku and their amazing maps, more on them later. So as someone that runs their game primarily through VTTs, maps are a really big part of my game. Every encounter uses a map and I end up making a lot of maps for my players. Now, something I've noticed is that it's all too easy for me to just throw down a map without thinking too much about it, and doing that often leads to combats and encounters that really lack a lot of pizzazz and interest. And today I want to talk to you about some of the steps I use to remind myself, hey, this can be more interesting. We can make better maps. I'm going to talk about how. So when we're making our maps, there's two things that we want to think about. We want to think about what's our story objective and also what's our mechanical objective. And working on these two things is going to make you have much more interesting encounters. In terms of the story, you want to be thinking, what are the players' goals and objectives? What purpose does this encounter serve from a narrative standpoint? If the only purpose of this encounter is to be a little bit of a roadblock or to use some resources, or it's a random encounter, then a lot more of your focus needs to be on the mechanics to make the encounter interesting versus leaning on the narrative and making interesting story elements. So thinking about the objective of your encounter, is the objective to defeat a certain set of enemies, or is it to find an item, chase a particular person, or get to a place? Thinking about those things are going to change how you make your map. If the objective of your session is for the players to get to a location, well, maybe your map needs to have more environmental challenges and represent more of that struggle of reaching the destination versus a straight up combat. Whereas if your objective is to defeat the big bad evil guy and have an epic climactic boss fight, then you're going to approach things very differently. So let's talk about the things that I like to do to make my encounter maps better and to have more enjoyable combats with these maps. The first thing to talk about is varied terrain. Now, all too often, and I'm guilty of this, I know, when I run an encounter, all of the terrain in the encounter is the same. If the players are fighting in a tavern, everything is just wooden planks. There's no variety in the kinds of terrain that's there. And it means that you don't have to think about moving around the battlefield. You don't have to take a lot of the terrain into consideration. But while doing this is easy, it does mean that you miss out on a lot of drama and narrative juice that you could be squeezing from this encounter by introducing more varied types of terrain. Let's take our tavern map, for example. Instead of just having everything be flat and even terrain, maybe in the first round of combat someone knocks over a beer keg and creates a liquid surface in an area of the map. Might not necessarily slow anyone down, but it might be slippy, someone might trip over, maybe it becomes difficult terrain, or maybe someone knocks over an oil lamp and spreads a patch of oil. This can be interacted with to make a patch of fire. If you think about the way a lot of video games handle this kind of thing, there's always things going on, stuff happening in the map that make it more interesting than everybody just stands in a line and hits each other. So if you've got an encounter that's happening outside, use different kinds of terrain, maybe some thickets of brambles that are going to slow people down, or a low river that you have to wade through, areas of quicksand or slick mud, anything that's going to change and impact the way the players and the enemies move around the battlefield. And the other thing that you want to consider when it comes to the terrain and the physical objects present in the space is cover. I can't tell you the number of times that I have run encounters and forgot about cover, as well as seen encounters where cover just doesn't come up. But cover can be a massive part of your encounters. If you are in that tavern example from earlier, throwing a table over on the side to use as cover and protect you from incoming crossbow bolts or thrown bottles is going to change the way that you play the encounter. If the enemies immediately flip up the tables, hide behind them, start peeking over to shoot at the players are going to react to that differently. Same for exterior maps. If you have an open plane and your players need to fight a bunch of enemies and those enemies are armed with bows and your players have got nothing but knives and swords, they're going to get shot to pieces on the way up. So you want to give them some opportunities to take cover, interact with the terrain on the way there. That might be things as simple as hiding behind trees or placing large rocks, but it could also be other elements like having wagons or pieces of terrain, stacks of boxes. If you've played any kind of shooting focused video game, you know the kinds of things that you expected to hide behind for chest high walls, and that's what you want to fill your map with so the players can interact with it in more interesting ways. ways. And speaking of interaction, the players and the enemies should be interacting with the map and the environment. This is one of the benefits, I think, of having a nice full color map versus a more simplified black and white sketch style map. In the sketch style map, you are relying a lot more on your description as the dungeon master to tell them exactly what is there, but in a nice full color map, you can place things like broken bottles on the tables in the tavern, or a round shield on the wall as decoration that the players or the enemies can interact with and they can see on the map, and that can prompt them to make decisions. So in that tavern environment, when the brawl kicks off, maybe one of the NPCs runs over to the wall, pulls the shield down and gets a buff to their AC because they've got this big decorative shield now that they can use to hide behind. Or they run over to a table that's full of bottles and they start throwing the bottles as ranged attacks, again forcing the players to hide behind tables, behind barrels, change their strategy. Having your NPCs interact with the environment is one of the best ways to get the players to start doing it, in my experience. Having them do interesting and maybe not optimal things involving the environment is a good way to signal to your players, hey, you can do this too, and it's going to be fun. My next tip for when it comes to designing maps that the players are going to enjoy to play around is every map should have one central key point of visual interest. So that doesn't necessarily mean that every map needs to have one statue right in the middle of it that really draws your attention. What I mean is that every map should have a key feature upon it that the players can interact with, the NPCs can interact with, or that can inform the combat in some way. If the players are fighting in the middle of a town square that does have a big statue like that, that's prime opportunity for that statue to get toppled, potentially fall on one of the player characters or NPCs, become cover, become interactable in a way that it wasn't before, and change the state of the battlefield. If you're running that tavern brawl, maybe there's a fireplace with a roaring fire in there, and one of the NPCs goes and takes the fire poker out of it to use as a weapon and accidentally drags a flaming log out of the fireplace and starts a fire, completely changing the environment and forcing everybody involved in the combat to deal with a new emerging situation. Obviously, this is tied to interactivity, but it's good to think about it as its own separate thing. Like, what key elements can I include? Like, notable features can I put on my map to make this really interesting? If the players are in a mine and they're fighting goblins, well, maybe I can put a lever and an elevator or a crane or something tactile for them to interact with to change the battlefield. Drop a bunch of boulders on some goblin's head, make a section of floor collapse, that kind of stuff. I often find myself spending hours trying to find the perfect battle map for my next session, but thanks to today's sponsor Cheipeku, I no longer need to struggle. Cheipeku makes some of the most beautiful fantasy maps out there, and you've almost certainly seen some of them before. Many of the most climactic battles of my campaigns have been fought over Cheipeku maps, so I am delighted to have them as a sponsor for the channel. Their Patreon is linked in the description below, and for as little as $5 a month, you can get access to over 4,000 high detail maps from their back catalogue. As a patron, you'll get access to a new pack of maps each month, and all the maps come in gridded and ungridded format, as well as with multiple different variants that change the lighting, time of day, weather, and more. You'll also get access to print-ready versions of the maps if you prefer to get them physically on the table for your players, and you get access to the awesome animated maps at the higher tier, as well as maps that are pre-configured to Foundry VTT. Patrons can also vote on future maps, use their maps in commercial projects, and a whole bunch more. Take your battle maps to the next level by checking out the link in the description, and thanks again to Cheipeku for supporting the channel. Another thing that I think that you should think about when you're making your maps is size and scale. Way too many maps, especially ones that you'll find in official modules, are so small. They are way too small for what they need to be. In real life, two people could probably have a reasonably satisfying fistfight in a room that is 20 feet by 20 feet. But in games like D&D and Pathfinder, that's a 4x4 grid, and that is just not big enough for a satisfying fight. It's one of my biggest gripes with official modules from most games. Obviously, it's due to the restrictions with print size, but they just don't make their maps big enough. The maps should be significantly larger to encourage players to move around and interact with the environment, and to give you some options when it comes to fleeing with characters or NPCs, as well as being able to change things as the combat progresses. What I frequently do with maps I find online is I just change the scale. So instead of a square being being 5 foot, it becomes 10 foot, and I add extra squares in my VTT just to give me that extra room for the players to move around in. And those are my quick tips for making more interesting encounter maps for your RPG games. I'd love to know what your tips for improving the playability of your maps is down in the comments below. If you haven't already, check out this video where I go over how to visually improve a lot of your maps. And until next time, happy gaming.